people have asked me before, like, wow, how difficult is it to write time travel because it's so twisty? If you look at if you wrote out like the plot narrative of Here and Now and Then, it's actually very, very linear. It takes place like, the first third takes place in like our present day, and then the middle third takes place in the future, and then the last third takes place in like the near future. So it's like if you look at them not as like time, but just as like locations or settings for an act of a book, it's actually really, really linear. This was really different writing that because I actually have a spreadsheet of details that I had to keep consistent from loop to loop, which I hadn't had to do before. And so when I turned it in, I told my editor, I am never writing a time loop again. Like logistically, it's so difficult to do because there's so much to keep track of.
Hello and welcome to this special author interview for FanFiAddict. I'm Frasier Armitage, part-time robot, full-time nerd. Joining me today is one of my absolute favorite authors. I'm so happy to get to talk to him. You'll know him from his books like Here and Now and Then and Light Years from Home and Star Wars Brotherhood. It is, of course, the Jedi Master of character-driven sci-fi, Mike Chen. Mike, how are you doing today?
Good. Hello, everyone.
It's great to talk to you. It's great to meet you. And the thing that I would really like to dig in with you about is your latest book, which is a quantum love story. Um, so for anybody who doesn't know what that book is or what it's about, give us a little bit of a flavor as to what we can expect from it.
It is a time loop, and I like to say that it differentiates itself from other time loop stories because it has two people in it, two people who are forced to live the same 4 days over and over, and as they try to figure out a way to not just survive and break through this, but to like live a life in it, they try to work through their own, I guess, personal issues too, and in doing so, find themselves becoming closer and closer together. Um, I feel like it's the closest to romance that I will write, which was a personal challenge for myself that I gave myself because I wanted to try to do something different and put like a romantic relationship front and center as opposed to like parent child or friends or siblings or something like that. Um, so it's not a spicy romance in like the traditional publishing sense. It's definitely a slow burn, but as from what I've heard, people are pretty happy with it so far.
Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It is, yeah, 10 out of 10 from me, Mike. I absolutely love the story. I thought what we could do is maybe explore the time loop stuff and then maybe the
Sure.
romance stuff after, because
Yeah.
it's such a perfect blend of them. It would be, I don't want to do one any disservice. So, time loops. Yeah, where did this idea of wanting to write a time loop come from? And was it different just sort of writing this compared to writing other stories that you've written before?
Yeah. So this personal thing I have for myself, because you readers, my readers will know that like every book has basically a different sci-fi or fantasy subgenre. And I really I don't want to go revisit a subgenre until I feel like I've exhausted all the things that I really enjoy. Um, but time loop is a little bit different from time travel. It has its own sort of story mechanic in it. And so this came about. It was actually, I got asked to write a proposal back in like 2018 or 19 for an IP that I cannot reveal, but involved two very established characters who, the way that they exist in their universe has some qualities similar to a time loop, but it's not a time loop. If I just said who they were and you knew who they were, you'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But otherwise, I'm being super cryptic about it. That proposal didn't go anywhere. Like they asked for it, and then they decided that they wanted to scrap the project, and so it just sat there. And then it kind of went through a few different iterations as I tried to adapt it to a few other requests. And then finally, I was like, I've seen these characters through 4 or 5 iterations, and I was like, I kind of like them. I want to give them their own space and make them like their own real people. And by then it had shifted into a time loop thing. It was more of a thriller at the time of the last proposal. And I looked at it and I thought, like, I'd really like to get in the head of two people who are in this, who are just totally not prepared for it. And what it would be like to like kind of coexist with someone in that. At the same time, I'm looking at this in probably mid to late 2021, and we all kind of joked, that like 2020 and part of 2021 was just like an awful time loop, and like you're just kind of like waiting for the world to figure its way out of it, and you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if everything's just going to collapse, and you can't really go anywhere or do anything. And that really, really influenced the vibe of this, like trying to find connection in such uncertain circumstances. Like, how do you find, joy or friendship or romance or anything like that? And the other thing that really influenced it was like during that time, my daughter, who was, let's see, what was her age then? I guess she would have been 5 to 6 at the time. And in like 2020, one of my author friends, like we were talking, our kids are the same age, and they're both into like their big things. Like they both really loved Adventure Time and Studio Ghibli films, and they didn't like, none of their friends did, and they couldn't see their friends anyways at the time. And so we always talked about how, like, hey, if we were at a con together, we should bring the kids and they would really love each other. But then everyone started using Zoom. And so I was like, what if they like watched a movie together over Zoom? Like these kids need something. And watching them, develop this friendship over like this most impossible of circumstances. Like just the fact that they found each other, and because the circumstances got everyone used to using Zoom, like they were able to build a friendship. For we actually like, her friend's birthday is Tuesday, I think. We just sent them a gift, but they just saw each other last week and played Among Us for like 5 hours, which is like really annoying to be around. But like, but they're very close friends, and I think like they will probably stay friends for the rest of their lives. And it's because a freaking pandemic happened in the time when we had digital communication. And so that was really one thing that influenced how I looked at, you know, two people trying to develop something that otherwise wouldn't happen. So like it's very, I say that like this is, I wrote a pandemic book, a few years ago, but this is my pandemic book.
Yeah, because I was gonna say, like, your imagination works in amazing ways because pre-pandemic you were writing pandemics, and then
Yeah,
mid-pandemic you're writing time loops, which is awesome. It's fantastic. I
it's
was really
definitely influenced by it.
yeah, yeah. I was really bowled over by how much thought you'd put into just how it would feel to live inside a time loop. I thought it came through really well. So it makes total sense that you'd been sitting on this idea and mulling it over for a long time because I felt as though there was so much that went into the book. How long did it take
Yeah.
you to get it down to like a 4 day time loop? Was that always the plan?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I think when I was in a proposal level, I think I played with it. I think I tried like 1 day, 2 days, like 1 week, 2 weeks, and I came down in 4 days, mostly because I needed there to be enough time that the characters could actually go do something. Because it's, the question people think about with like a theoretical time loop is like, what would you do in it? And it's like, if you only have 24 hours, like you could not fly somewhere and enjoy, the time zone difference and all that stuff. So I needed to give it enough space that they could actually go do something without it being like, if you lived in a time loop and it was like a month, like I don't think that would be too distressing, you know. But 4 days felt like a right amount where it's like it gives you a taste of being able to indulge in the things that you want to do, but it's still so short that it doesn't feel consequential. Like you have to get out of it to have some sort of real life.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I was curious about if you were trapped in a 4 day time loop. are there 4 days of your life that you would like to go back to, or that if you could choose the dates and times, or would it just be it didn't matter because a time loop is what you make it?
Yeah, I think it would probably be the latter. What I would do, I think like I would change the indulgence from loop to loop. Like I would, one of the things that I would do is like I would go to as many like concerts as possible. That's my thing. So I would just like fly everywhere to see every band that I wanted to see. Um, but then I'd be like, I would take one 4-day segment and just like try to beat a video game in it because I can't save my game outside of the loop. you things like that. It's not like you could catch up on shows because you could be like, oh, even if Netflix doesn't save your spot, you can just go back to it. But your video game, like you're kind of screwed without that save data. Um, yeah, so I would probably just like indulge in a lot of stuff. The way that in this book, Carter is a big foodie, and he talks about how like his cholesterol resets, his bank accounts reset, and so he just like orders all of the stuff that he could not afford or is just terrible for him. And that actually comes from my wife. Like I really don't care about food at all. Like I tell my wife, like 99% of food tastes the same to me. It's it's just there for like sustenance and mild enjoyment. But she would do what Carter does. Like she would order like in breakfast every morning, and it would be like massive with multiple dishes, so she could take like just a single bite out of them. Like that would sustain her for probably like hundreds of time loops. Like and flying over like overseas to check out every cafe in France and things like that. So I think like my scientific brain would try to push for a way out of it. But in terms of just like the pure indulgences, I think like for me it would mostly be going to concerts.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you're like the Mariana of your household, and your wife's like the Carter.
Yes,
Yeah, that's
yes, very
great.
much so. Yeah.
And with regard to this, obviously, you mentioned about time travel before, and this being different to time travel. But Here and Now and Then, your debut book was an amazing book. So you're not new to like the idea of playing with time. I just wondered if was there anything that you learned writing Here and Now and Then that helped you as you were writing a quantum love story, or did it just feel completely fresh as you were writing it?
It felt different. The thing with Here and Now and Then, like it's funny because I've someone people have asked me before, like, wow, how difficult is it to write time travel because it's so twisty. If you look at the if you wrote out like the plot narrative of Here and Now and Then, it's actually very, very linear. It takes place like the first third takes place in like our present day, and then the middle third takes place in the future, and then the last third takes place in like the near future. So it's like if you look at them not as like time but just as like locations or settings for an act of a book, it's actually really, really linear. This was really different writing that because I actually have a spreadsheet of details that I had to keep consistent from loop to loop, which I hadn't had to do before. And so when I turned it in, I told my editor, I am never writing a time loop again. Like logistically, it's so difficult to do because there's so much to keep track of. And like there's this scene where like they're crossing the street to get to the main accelerator, and it's very similar to something that happens early on. And I had to match like exactly who are the people they passed, like when did the cars like cross the street, like who drops their coffee, things like that. And it's like I don't want to track those kinds of details anymore. It's really, really difficult. So I imagine like writing it is difficult. I can't even imagine being on like a film or TV production with a time loop because like the continuity stuff you would have to track is just insane.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And one of the things that I thought was really impressive about the way that you structured the book was that as a reader, you get used to the loop as well. So you get used to seeing the same people and the same things. So you feel that aspect of it, but you somehow manage from loop to loop to build something and make it just slightly different. It doesn't feel like you're reading the same thing over and over. And I thought that was really clever. Did that was that a challenge to sort of build that into it?
Yeah, that was really difficult. So one of the things that I had to do was think about from a structure perspective, how do you write a loop without making it overly repetitive? And so I rewatched a lot of like time loop TV episodes, and a lot of places like did it differently. Like if you look at cause and effect from Star Trek The Next Generation, like they pace out the loops like very evenly. There's a really like one of my favorite TV shows of all time that not enough people know about is Legends of Tomorrow, which is a DC Arrowverse show. It's completely bonkers in the best way. But they had a time loop episode called Here I Go Again, and that one paced it differently, where like it made use of like montages more to kind of like track the passage of time, like when they just needed to like condense stuff in there. So what I ultimately wound up doing, there's a book, if you haven't read it personally, I think you would really like it because you like my stuff. It's by Catriona Silvey called Meet Me in Another Life. It's was like my favorite book of 2021 or 22 whenever it came out. And when I read it, I messaged Catriona. I'm like, I wish I wrote this. I'm so mad. Like it's really really for people who read my books, I think they'll love it. And so her book is about two people who um, keep kind of like reappearing in each other's lives, and then they die and they resurrect as like different types of people. Like their relationship is like parent child, and then they're lovers, and then they're friends, and then they're coworkers, and then they ultimately try to figure out what's happening because they start remembering each other from life to life. um, and I talked with her about it, how she did it and how she broke out her structure. And so like my structure is actually really similar to hers because like the pacing of it, including the twist that kind of makes act 3 its own thing, is very similar to hers. And I thought that was a really smart way to, like, the first part of the book you spend in mostly like the first loop because it establishes the rhythm of like, what is this going to be? And then you have like some loops where it's like, what is this? I don't understand. And then you can start playing around with like, is it a montage section where like we just like drop a bunch of information, or like what do we need to see? And I think because at that point, like, it's building the relationship as it's going through the mystery, it's important to see like key moments of them trying different things, both for themselves and for them trying to break out the mystery. So that's where like the pacing came from. But again, I am never writing a time loop. Again, it's really difficult.
Yeah, totally. It's like I feel like, you mentioned about the Next Generation episode. I feel like that is a really, really like classic example of like a time loop thing. And you have other like classic examples of time loop things. But like you said before, like they all seem to have a like although they're told differently, they all seem to have like a similar vibe. The thing that I loved about this is that it felt like a fresh take on a time loop. Which was really, really cool. Did you consciously, as you were watching and researching all of these other different time loop stuff, were you sort of noting things that were like, oh, okay, yeah, I don't want to do it like that. I want to try different from this, or were you just trying to sort of take the best bits, or how did you research it?
I think my main thing was having the two people experience it. Because like when I went into this, I couldn't remember any other time, no pun intended, where two people were in the loop together. And then I think from like a sci-fi world building perspective, like it really wouldn't make sense if two people were able to experience a loop together. Like there would have to be some sort of mechanism for that. So I had to kind of conjure that up from the ground up here. But in most cases, like there's no physical reason for that to actually happen. Like whether you have like a magic time loop like Groundhog Day or like a Star Trekky like science based one. So that was like it's usually like one person who has to inform other people and trigger their memories, through some sort of means. And so as long as I could get away from that and then use it more as kind of like this almost like a prison for two people to develop a relationship, that's where like I think the story really stands apart from most time loops.
Yeah, definitely. It's because even stuff like with source code and things, it's always just the one person who's in it. Whereas in this, it very much is like the two. And what's really good is it's got the it's because of the way that you introduce the way that these two come about. You've got one character who knows a lot more about what's going on than the other. So it isn't like you just throw them both in and they both have to figure it out sort of like together. As a reader, you're able to really get your head around it really quick. You
Yeah,
don't waste
there's a
time on
point
like,
of
oh, what's happening.
exposition.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it's great.
that's more of like a structured trick, because it's like I played around with that, where like what if they both go in, not knowing anything, and they just bump into each other, and it's like it would take way too long to ramp up to it. So the book originally in a previous draft, it opens with Mariana. But then my editor said, like, we should actually see, let's take one chapter with Carter, he knows what's going on, so he can info dump, in hopefully an exciting way, but get that shorthand to the reader in like in one chapter so they understand what's happening. And then we jump to Mariana, and then we can experience her emotions through it. So I thought that was a really good call by my editor.
Yeah, it really was. It really sets the book like on fire from page one. It's brilliant. And if you're never writing a time loop book again, and this is your one and only, um, what kind of things did you learn from writing in the time loop genre that you think you'll be able to sort of take into other subgenres? What did it allow you to do really well? That you'd like to,
Ooh,
aspects of it that you'd like to try again, maybe in something else.
that's a good question. I mean, I think with the time loop, like pacing is even more critical than other types of genres, because you are working with like a really condensed and structured frame for character interactions. So I think like probably like thinking about how to pace out like what was important, what needed to be shown up close, and what could just be like montaged away. That's probably like the biggest lesson from this.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool. So we've chatted time loops, and I love time travel and time loops and stuff. It's so my jam. I absolutely adore it. Love stories. Everybody loves a love story, right? Um, so you mentioned earlier about the idea of sort of like this it's sort of coming up, this idea of a love story sort of organically. How did it feel when you actually realized, oh, hang on a minute, I'm going to be writing a love story? Did you ever have that moment where you're like, oh, I really thought this was a good idea, and now it's not. So it doesn't seem to be, or was it just a joy to write?
So it was very intentional from like when I started going from proposal to draft. I think my worry is like, I don't read much in that genre of like, like general, like I read contemporary fiction, I read women's fiction, but like what is classified as romance with like, different degrees of like spiciness, like I don't read that at all. I think this might be the only book with the word love story in the title that only has two kisses in the entire book. um but so I was very fortunate that my editor, part of her list is, more traditional romance books and rom-coms. And so she was able to advise me, where like I would send her like an outline, and she said like, okay, well, like we should actually have more of like a meet cute with them, like right up front. Like let's get that in there. And then she's like, make sure to remember to put in there that like they're both physically attractive to each other. I'm like, oh yeah, like I don't really think about that. um, like she would say like you can tone, like add more flirting here, tone it down here. It was really important to have someone like that help guide me, because I think like, my instincts were probably like 75% there, and then 25% like I'm thinking more like usual sci-fi type of stuff. So it was, I needed the help, definitely. um, and also like, talking with my editor up front, like, saying that this is not going to be like I want the romance between these two characters to be very central to their motivations and to the plot, but I'm not looking at this as like a romance book per se. It's funny because the book, when I submitted it, the title was called "Tomorrow Is Another Day," which I took from a song by the excellent band Ladytron. Um, and I remember my editor said like that title fits, but we want to try something that gets to a broader audience because we think that the romance aspect of it will go with that. And then I go like, what about a time loop romance? Because I had like they had suggested some titles. Like there was I think there's like Beach Read, and I'm blanking on the other ones, but there were like some fairly like pun literal titles that have been really successful. And so I said like, what about a time loop romance? Because that's kind of what it is. And they said like, well, we can't use the word romance because people will expect, spicy stuff, but let's work with that. And they said time loop sounds too sci-fi. And so they shot back a quantum love story. And I'm like, that's fine. Let's just go with it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that. Um, I know for me, as a writer, I if I was to sit down and write a romance book where I knew that that's what I was going to be doing, I'd be terrified because it's been so
I
long.
was terrified.
Yeah, it's so long since since me and my wife fell in love that I don't know. Like, how do you do it? It's like I've completely forgotten
Yeah.
how. Like, was it sort of like almost like riding a bike when you started, or was it hard to sort of get back into that mind frame of, right, okay, I've got to have these characters woo one another? What was it like?
Yeah. There was a bit of like kind of breaking down what goes into that because I mean like I've been with my wife for 20 years, and like what do? We play video games and watch Star Trek together. It's like our relationship is kind of like established within like these frameworks of things that we really love. um and so to kind of I had to rethink about like how do you discover what someone is about. And then once you get past like the superficial things of like what are you interested in, what is it about personal connection that makes you attracted to them. I think it really came down to, these two people, they are different in a lot of ways in terms of personality, but they can see each other um like authentically, and I think that's what we really want from a partner. And to be able to watch Star Trek with them, like that's really important. um but so that was really like, first I had to kind of break that down. And it was funny because I think like some of my Star Wars work, like when I wrote my Star Wars book, one of my goals for myself was like I want the reader to just freaking love Anakin Skywalker. And part of that was getting them to understand why Anakin and Padme would get married so fast. And so I would like just make these notes about like breaking down like who they were as people, and then finding out like why would these two people be attracted to each other, aside from the fact that they're, Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman, two really good looking people. Once you took that out of it, like, what is it about their personalities that are like magnets for them? And so some of that work, that sort of like breaking down like the kind of like under structure of a relationship, that really helped here. So that, and having an editor who edits romance.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I kind of felt like, I know you mentioned earlier about 99% of food it just tastes the same, but I kind of feel like maybe there's a little bit of love in there for like donuts, because I came away from this book really craving donuts in a way that I haven't done for a long time.
So
Um,
I will say, like, my wife gets like, gourmet donuts that cost too much, and she gets like all these different flavors, and I'm like, I just like glazed donuts. That's all I want. I don't need your like, I can't even describe the types that she gets, but I'll try them, and I'm like, that's okay, but can I get the glazed? So that's me in there.
I feel like if there was like a company like Krispy Kreme or Dunkin' that were suddenly just like looking for a story that they could use, I think this is it. It's like because it's
Yeah,
just
they should
it,
sponsor me.
they totally should, right? They totally should. Um, the with regard to like because the one thing that I think really stands out in all of your books is how brilliantly you write characters, and writing characters that fall in love. Um, did it kind of free you up in some ways? Because you knew what their trajectory was going to be, how their relationship was going to unfold, or was it a little bit of a challenge? Knowing how the book was going to go from the outset when it came to figuring out the characters.
Well, I do write everything with an outline. So I'm a pretty I would say I'm not a strict outliner. Like I give myself the flexibility to move, but I am a deep outliner. So my outlines, um they usually go from like 5 to 10,000 words or so. And when I get an outline that I'm satisfied with, like I can actually like break it down into like chapter by like I can just put like chapter 1 over like these 3 lines, and then hit enter a few times and write chapter 2, so I can look at the narrative structure of it. So I'm already like I know their trajectories. What I have found between even writing like the most in-depth outline, you don't really know the characters until you're like in the prose with them. So while the plot elements remain the same, like their feelings in there evolve. And so that takes time. And so even though I had the characteristics of like I knew Carter, like what I try to do is like I assign like random quirks to characters, because we all have like really random quirks that don't really make sense, they're just there. And so once I assign that, then I start writing from that perspective. And then it starts to kind of like seep into who the character is. And then there's like this logic that just happens of like why it ties into their personality and the way that their brain thinks. So like it was a process to get to that point. You want to say like it's like Luke Skywalker's parents have to fall in love at some point, but like you want to know why. And so again, it comes down to like kind of breaking that down and like getting into their heads and playing with them like in a sandbox, and then it kind of starts to make sense.
Yeah, that's really good. I kind of feel like with character work, I have a similar kind of thing where it's only when you start writing that they really sort of like you really get inside their heads. Is But I know that you cast your
Yeah.
books in your head sort of like beforehand. Um, what was the cast for this book, and why did you opt for them?
So this book, because it's funny because this book existed in several different proposals, including one of them, for a licensed IP. Like I didn't have casting, like mental casting for them. Like I do that as a bit of a shortcut. It's a cheat. It's a total cheat, because that way I can describe someone instead of trying to picture an imaginary person myself. So I had written, I think I was like halfway through this, and then like in my head as I'm writing, there's still kind of like fuzzy characters. And then I was watching the Netflix adaptation of Cowboy Bebop, which I'm still really pissed off that they canceled, because like there was a few pacing moments in that series, but I loved that cast so much. I thought that was just cast so perfectly, and it had so much potential, and I was so mad about that. But when I was looking at it, I was like, oh, John Cho would be perfect for this. Um, and Daniela Pineda, who plays Faye in Cowboy Bebop, like I'm gonna make her Mariana. And like it just worked. And finally, like when I did that, I made that choice. It just felt like I could hear them better, I could see them better, and it just totally clicked for me. And so that's why like I wouldn't usually name the characters' last names after the actors' last names, but in this place, like I didn't know what to name them, so I just like screw it, I'm just gonna grab that and go.
That's perfect. I love it. And I feel the same as you. I feel like, we should bring back the bebop. It was, yeah,
Yes,
it
it was
went too
great.
soon. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
and
still
it's
mad
like
about that. I signed the petition and everything.
well, I'm a huge fan of the cartoon of the original. I know
Mhm,
that
me
a
too.
lot of the sort of angst about it came about from people who loved the original and weren't quite as keen as the live action, but thought they were very different in like lots of really good
Yeah.
ways and very similar in lots of good ways. I couldn't get behind the purist viewpoint, if you know what I mean. But I
It
guess
might be because, like, as a creator, like, I'm kind of accepted the idea that, like, material gets licensed and adapted as opposed to, like, straight translations, and I often find, like, now, like, one of my favorite TV shows of all time was, Being Human, which, like, there was the UK version and then there was a US version, and I loved the UK version, but then the US version came out, and I remember like the US version, like it follows the UK version like almost step for step for like 4 or 5 episodes, and I was like, what are they doing? This doesn't like this is very redundant. And then like something happens, and it's like starts to diverge like very heavily. And I read like this was like an intentional choice with them, where they're like, there's a lot that worked, and we know that people really love that. So like we can bring in that audience, we can bring in a new audience that doesn't know it, but we have to become our own at some point. And I really felt like with the Netflix Cowboy Bebop, like they were I, it seemed like that was the trajectory that they were going on, where they're like, we have to honor what came before, and what established these characters, and we're going to work with that. But then you're going to start to see it diverge, because we could potentially run for like 4 or 5 seasons, and we need more story. Yeah, and so like I don't know, I find purity culture with pretty much anything is a bad idea. But so I wish they brought that back. I miss you, John Cho.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly. If you're listening, Netflix, like, yeah, bring it back.
Yeah, come on.
The
Stop canceling everything, Netflix.
I think that yeah, the thing with IPs and stuff is that you've had the opportunity to write for a couple of IPs that I know that you absolutely love. So you've written Star Wars
Yeah.
Brotherhood. You also got
Mhm.
to write your DS9 comic, which is awesome. Um, has writing in these other universes that you love, has that affected your storytelling at all when it comes to your own stuff, or has it influenced the way you imagine your own stories?
I would say so. From a technical perspective, Brotherhood, up to a certain point, was the biggest synopsis slash outline that I had written, and it was done out of necessity. Like they ask you to write a short synopsis at first. It's like 3,000 words, and then as feedback comes in from like the editorial team from Lucasfilm about like like what story beats would they like to see, or like which characters you are or not allowed to use, it just grows and grows and grows. And like that's the first time I eclipsed 10,000 words for a for an outline. And as I was writing it, because I know, Obi-Wan and Anakin, like I could hear their voices, I could see their faces. So I'm writing this outline, and I'm just finding like dialogue is just spilling out of my head. So like some of the speeches from Brotherhood like existed in the outline, and like I'm just thinking, I'm not going to have a lot of time for this, so I'm writing everything down now. I don't care how big this gets. And so that process, that is something that I've actually carried forward. Because before it was like, I try to just like a beat sheet becomes like a chapter outline, becomes something like bigger. Okay, so before Star Wars, I would probably go get like an outline that's like 4 or 5 thousand words. But now that like having seen how quickly, how much easier it is to go from outline to draft, like the bigger the outline gets, that was like my biggest takeaway from that, was like go ahead and write that 10 to 15,000 word outline, because everything becomes kind of more like rudimentary, like filling in prose as opposed to like making storytelling decisions. And writing, revising an outline to get bigger and bigger and more in depth, each time you do that, you run through the scenario in your head. And so you can add on and make decisions, because like these characters and these worlds have been stewing in your head enough that it's not just a like, let me just jot it down to send to my agent or my editor or whatever. It is like active revision. So that's probably like the biggest thing that I took away from Star Wars. In terms of Star Trek, because I was writing a comic, um, like I didn't know the format before. So like shout out to my friend Amanda Dybert who sent me a bunch of her example scripts because I was like, oh okay, I can work with this. I find that dialogue is one of my very like natural strengths, and so when I write a skeleton draft, it's usually dialogue with some prose and some stage direction as placeholder. So it really helped, like 'cause writing a comic, I'm supposed to write the stage direction but also like suggestions for the art team as well, and so I could visualize it there, and that actually helped like in terms of like starting to beat out like subsequent outlines, is like the sort of visualization process that came from comics, that really kind of carried over. So I feel like it's added, these two projects have added many more tools to like my craft toolbox.
Yeah, that's really good to hear because I think we learn so much, don't we, as writers, from the stuff that we write from project to project. But when your project
Yeah.
is not something that comes from initially a world you've invented, but somebody else's world, it must be just so disorienting to not just be able to make something up, just to be able to be like, oh, okay, no, what exists? I have to go and adhere to this.
It's like
But it's
I
go on.
I still feel like it because I used to write fan fiction. I just don't have time for it now, but I feel like it's very much the same muscle, like writing IP, um, because it's still very much like you're working in some pre-established sandbox, and that makes it in most cases really easier to do. In fan fiction, you don't have to get corporate approval for it. Um, and so like the main thing is just like asking questions in advance of like, can I use this thing or this character? And I don't know if most people have the same experience that I do, but I found like 90% of the responses was yes, you can do that. And it might be because like I checked myself quite a bit of like I probably shouldn't ask for that, you know. I try to keep it within a very logical scope of things.
Yeah, it's like let's kill Anakin in this book. It's like no, you can't do that. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I
Nothing
think
breaking like that.
yeah, yeah. I feel like you've written for Star Wars, you've written for Star Trek. I feel like with a quantum love story and Here and Now and Then as well in your repertoire, I feel like the BBC should give you Doctor Who. I feel like that should be something.
I have
If they
friends who've written for Big Finish, so they've written official Who stories. I would be really intimidated to write Who, as much as I love it, and I really really do. I mean, you can probably see there's a TARDIS in the back of my room here, um, but like I find that like Who requires a certain amount of like structural cleverness that like I don't know if I could just like come up with on like a just a one-off story, because my stuff tends to be like very grounded in character. Like I think if you gave me like a Martha Jones spin-off to write, like I could do that, but like an actual like take the Doctor and the TARDIS and like solve some sort of cataclysm, like the amount of like clever like puzzle box thinking, like sometimes like I think about like if you think about like the structure of like Blink, since everyone knows Blink, it's like it's so intricate, and like the reveal at like just the end, I'm like, oh god, how do you even do that? Like I don't know if I could do that sort of thing. But then if you gave me something that's that's a little bit more character based, and that would probably involve like focus more on the companion rather than the Doctor, I would love to try that.
yeah, you see, I think now that you've with what you do in a quantum love story, I think that there's nothing you couldn't do on a structure when it comes to structure. I think you'd be the perfect person to do it, Mike. If there was a iteration of the Doctor or a companion that would be like the your absolute favorite to write for, is there one that you would love to sort of like explore a little bit in fiction?
It would be totally cheating to say Clara Oswald because I have like this massive crush on Jenna Coleman. So here's a fun fact about Here and Now and Then. The character of Penny was cast in my head as Jenna Coleman. So I'm just like writing her voice, seeing her face, So it's like that would be kind of cheating. Um, you know, I, the thing the thing with like everyone says like who's your favorite doctor, and I find that like I like them all pretty much equally for like different reasons. And certain times I will go visit certain other doctors, for whatever reason. Like right now, Peter Capaldi is like my comfort watch doctor. But that doesn't mean like I love Jodie's run. I love Paul McGann. Like I wish like his voice is just so suited for audio drama. He's brilliant. Um, I would I would like to write a 12 and Bill story because Bill was a wonderful character that did not get enough time, and I really, really wish she had a second season. Uh, that's probably where I would go to, but like I would love to write like a Paul McGann type of thing where like from a character perspective, and a lot of this has already been explored in Big Finish, so it would probably be redundant, but like as an outsider who's refusing to participate in the time war, I would love to think about like the character impact of that because I think we've all been in situations where you can see something like either personally or family or even like the world like cataclysmically happening, but there's something in you that's like refusing to participate. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore. But I mean, Paul has so many stories in Big Finish. Like I'm not sure where those gaps still exist. Because I
Yeah,
think like
it's
I've probably listened to like maybe 10 Big Finishes with him, but there's like hundreds. So
I feel like I remember the TV movie that he did, and it stuck in my mind the scene where the master's going through into the bed, and then it really there's something about. I know he didn't have like a big screen run or anything, but there's something about that particular sort of rendition of it that they did stuff that really sticks with you. You know, it's really really cleverly done. I really like that you've mentioned Paul McGann because I think he's such an underrated doctor. But that's awesome. So we've got Netflix for Cowboy Bebop. We've got Big Finish for the Doctor Who thing. So if you know, for all those who are listening out there, that's great. For me, you've given me some great things. You got Meet Me in Another Life and Tomorrow's Another Day by Lady Tron. I must go and give that a listen. That's absolutely great. Um, what kind of things are you into at the moment? What kind of things is on your radar, and kind of maybe projects that you're thinking about in the future?
so right now I'm currently working on my Marvel project, which is what if Moon Knight was a host to Venom, and I just turned in the manuscript for that, and that was it's it's interesting going from a time loop structure to Moon Knight, who has dissociative identity disorder, and trying to and then hosts Venom. So it's like, how are you going to get like his three personalities and Khonshu, the Egyptian god who lives in his head, and Venom like all into a narrative together. So that took some clever thinking, like from a structure perspective. So that I just turned that in, and that comes out in October. Um, and then there's like everything's kind of like in like the murky waters of the publishing industry right now. So I am going to like just kind of take some time to try to read and play video games and watch stuff for now because like my backlog is just so huge. I was thinking like I saw that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is coming out. I'm like, God, I didn't even finish Final Fantasy VII Remake yet. So it's like things like that. Like I'm really looking forward to like finally having the time to get to.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds so exciting, and yeah, all the best with this. I can't wait to see what you've come up with Venom and Moon Knight. It sounds so exciting, and all the best with your downtime and finding your next project. It's great, and if I was in a 4 day time loop, 100% on my list would be let's get to the end of the TBR because I would need a time
Yes.
loop to be able to get through all of the books that I've got on
I
there, but.
Yeah, books and TV shows, like, there's just such a huge backlog and things that I wanna revisit, and I'm like, I do not have the time for it. So, like, I'm trying to be very conscious of, like, refueling in a way, like, creatively with that.
Yeah, all the best with it, Mike. And thank you so much for joining me. And for everybody who has enjoyed listening in and wants to sort of contact you or get in touch or find out more about the book, the Quantum Love Story, how can they do so?
So, my handle on almost all social media is Mike Chen Writer. There are a lot of people named Mike Chen on the planet, so you have to add Mike Chen Writer. Um, so I'm still semi-active on Twitter, but Twitter is a collapsing hellscape. I really enjoy Blue Sky, so it's probably best to hit me up there. I'm on Instagram, but I don't use it much. So that's probably like the best place. I have a website called MikeChenBooks.com, which I don't update enough. But the official information does get there eventually. So, and I'm hoping that in like the next few months I'll be able to announce some more projects. But it's all like kind of in like the mysteries of how the publishing industry works.
Yeah, fantastic. So thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to everyone who's listened, and all the best, Mike.
Thank you for having me.